The Luna the Alpha King was forbidden to claim. What kind of fate could make the most powerful Alpha King unable to claim his own Luna? And what force could stand between destiny and the bond everyone believes can never be broken? If stories of forbidden love and impossible choices keep you coming back, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one. Now tell me this, should anyone have the power to forbid a fated bond? With that question lingering in the air, the night grows still, the kingdom holds its breath, and the path toward a story whispered in fear and remembered for generations quietly begins. No law has ever been stronger than destiny, but every kingdom has tried to prove otherwise. The moon hung low above Blackthorn Keep, washing the ancient fortress in silver, so pale it made every tower seem carved from ice instead of stone. Hundreds of lanterns flickered along the castle walls while nobles, warriors, and elders crossed the marble courtyards in quiet anticipation, their footsteps echoing beneath towering archways draped with royal banners bearing the crest of the White Wolf crown. Tonight was meant to celebrate unity. Every invitation carried the same promise. Every whispered conversation circled the same expectation. Before dawn, Alpha King Lucian Ashcroft would officially begin the ancient rites to choose the Luna destined to stand beside him and secure the future of the Northern Kingdom. Yet hidden beneath the polished traditions and practiced smiles lingered a tension that no music could soften. Royal guards occupied every entrance with unusual vigilance. Council members exchanged uneasy glances whenever anyone mentioned the Moon Archives, quickly lowering their voices before curious ears wandered too close. It was as though the castle itself carried a secret too dangerous to speak aloud beneath the full moon. Far beyond the glowing ballroom, through a maze of quiet stone corridors rarely traveled by honored guests, another figure waited in complete silence. Evelyn Carter stood beside a narrow window overlooking the royal gardens, the cool night breeze stirring loose strands of her chestnut hair as moonlight traced gentle lines across her pale skin. Her simple ivory dress lacked the jewels and embroidered silks worn by the noble daughters gathering inside the great hall. She had never expected them. Servants had escorted her here hours earlier with polite but unmistakably firm instructions. She was not to enter the ceremony. She was not to appear before the Alpha King. She was not to let anyone know she had even been invited to the castle. No explanation followed those commands, and every question she quietly asked was answered with the same uncomfortable silence. She had spent her entire life accepting that silence. It followed her through every village she called home, through every celebration where she stood in the background, through every conversation that stopped the moment she entered the room. People rarely looked at her with hatred. Somehow that felt easier to understand. Instead, they looked at her with caution, as though they had been warned about something they themselves did not fully believe. Evelyn rested one hand against the cool stone wall, listening as distant music drifted from the grand hall, carried through open windows by the evening wind. Somewhere beyond those walls, the kingdom celebrated a future she was never meant to witness. Somewhere beyond those walls, the most powerful Alpha in generations prepared to walk toward a destiny everyone believed had already been decided. And without knowing why, Evelyn could not shake the quiet certainty growing inside her heart that before this endless night surrendered to morning, everything the kingdom believed to be certain would begin to change. The celebration beyond the castle walls only grew louder as the evening deepened, but inside the forgotten corridor where Evelyn waited, time seemed unwilling to move at all. Every passing minute carried another distant burst of music, another wave of cheerful voices, another reminder that the entire kingdom had gathered for a moment she had been forbidden to witness. She turned away from the window when soft footsteps approached across the polished stone floor. An elderly servant dressed in the silver colors of the royal household stopped several feet away, lowering his eyes before speaking with careful respect. "Miss Carter, I've been instructed to bring you fresh tea and remind you to remain here until further notice." Evelyn offered him a grateful smile. "Has anyone explained why I cannot attend?" The old servant hesitated only for a heartbeat before gently shaking his head. "Some questions have remained unanswered for longer than I have served this castle." His quiet words lingered after he disappeared into the shadows, leaving Evelyn with the unsettling feeling that even those who lived within these walls carried secrets they dared not name. Across the palace, beneath soaring crystal chandeliers that reflected thousands of tiny lights across the polished marble floor, King Lucian Ashcroft entered the grand hall. Conversations faded almost instantly as every noble bowed with practiced elegance. Tall, calm, and carrying himself with effortless confidence, Lucian acknowledged the crowd with little more than a respectful nod before taking his place near the moon throne. The ceremony should have felt familiar. He had attended similar gatherings since childhood, memorizing every ancient custom expected of a future ruler. Yet, tonight something felt strangely incomplete. It was not fear. It was not uncertainty. It was an absence he could not explain. His silver eyes slowly traveled across the assembled guests. Every noble family had presented a daughter worthy of consideration. Their gowns shimmered beneath the candlelight. Their confident smiles reflected years of careful preparation for this very evening. Still, none of them quieted the restless feeling growing deeper inside him. Elder Magnus stepped closer and lowered his voice. "Your Majesty, everything has been arranged exactly as the council requested." Lucian looked toward him without breaking his composed expression. "Exactly as the council requested," he repeated, almost thoughtfully. "Not as tradition requested." The elder paused before answering. Certain adjustments became necessary. Before Lucian could ask another question, a breeze slipped through the towering windows overlooking the royal gardens. It carried with it the unmistakable scent of blooming white, jasmine mixed with fresh rain, delicate yet impossible to ignore. Lucian suddenly became still. The elegant music, the conversations, even the ceremonial announcements seemed to disappear beneath a single heartbeat. His instincts awakened with quiet certainty. Somewhere within the castle stood someone he had never met, yet every part of his soul recognized. His eyes shifted toward the open doors leading into the endless corridors beyond the ballroom. For one brief moment, he considered abandoning centuries of royal tradition to follow nothing more than a feeling. At the opposite end of the palace, Evelyn lifted her head as the same cool breeze drifted through the narrow window beside her. Without understanding why, her heartbeat matched a rhythm she had never heard before, as though somewhere inside the castle another heart had answered its call. Neither of them knew that unseen eyes were already watching from the highest gallery, where members of the royal council stood hidden behind carved stone screens, silently waiting to see whether fate could once again be kept apart by human hands. High above the grand hall, hidden behind carved marble screens that had concealed generations of royal decisions, the members of the royal council watched every movement below without speaking. Their faces remained calm, but unease settled heavily between them. At the center stood Chancellor Roland Whitmore, the oldest living advisor to the crown. His silver hair caught the candlelight as he slowly unrolled a weathered parchment sealed with dark blue wax that had never been broken outside this chamber. Around him, the counselors lowered their eyes with quiet reverence. "He felt it," one whispered. "The bond has awakened." Roland nodded almost reluctantly, just as the archives warned. Another elder stepped closer, his voice barely louder than the wind pressing against the stained glass windows. "Does His Majesty know?"
"No," Roland answered.
And he must not know. Not tonight. Far below them, Lucian remained standing before the moon throne, but his attention had drifted far beyond the smiling nobles, waiting to impress him. Every graceful introduction sounded strangely
distant.
Every carefully rehearsed conversation faded beneath the quiet certainty growing stronger inside him. The mysterious scent had disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived, yet its memory lingered with impossible clarity. He had spent years mastering discipline, learning never to allow instinct to overpower judgment. Tonight, that discipline felt fragile. His wolf did not grow restless from anger or excitement. It simply wanted to search. Across the palace, Evelyn slowly wandered through the peaceful corridor, careful not to disturb the silence surrounding her. The royal gardens stretched below the narrow windows like silver waves beneath the moonlight. White roses climbed ancient stone walls while small fountains reflected stars that shimmered across the water. She paused beside a portrait hanging alone at the end of the hallway. It showed a young woman dressed in simple white robes rather than royal silk. Unlike the grand paintings throughout the castle, this one carried no name beneath its frame. Only a single inscription remained carved into the polished wood. The moon remembers what kingdoms choose to forget. Evelyn reached out almost instinctively, her fingertips barely brushing the edge of the frame, before footsteps echoed somewhere behind her. She turned quickly, but the hallway stood empty once more. The quiet should have comforted her. Instead, it felt as though the castle itself had noticed her presence. Hidden above the grand hall, Roland carefully rolled the ancient parchment closed. No one questioned the order that followed because every council member already feared it. Double the guards protecting the eastern corridors, he instructed calmly. No one approaches the guest chamber without council approval. A younger advisor hesitated. What if the king asks to inspect the castle? Roland looked toward the ballroom where Lucian continued greeting noble families with composed dignity. Then we guide him elsewhere, exactly as our predecessors have done for generations. The younger man swallowed carefully. Can destiny truly be delayed forever? Roland did not answer immediately. His eyes drifted toward the moon shining through the cathedral windows before he finally spoke in a voice almost too quiet to hear. Forever?
No.
But every generation believed they had one more night. At that exact moment, another gentle breeze crossed the castle, carrying the fragrance of white jasmine through corridors, staircases, and open balconies. Lucian lifted his head instantly. Evelyn closed her eyes, without realizing why. Somewhere between them, unseen and untouched, an ancient promise had taken its very first step toward becoming impossible to hide. The first sound that broke the ceremony was not a royal announcement, but the steady toll of the ancient moon bell echoing through every wing of Blackthorn Keep. Conversations faded as every guest turned toward the center of the grand hall where polished, white stone reflected the silver glow pouring through the towering windows. According to tradition, this marked the beginning of the procession of names, when every invited family would be formally recognized before the Alpha King. Lucian remained seated for only a moment before rising with measured grace. Every movement reflected years of discipline, yet the restless feeling within him refused to settle. Elder Magnus stepped forward carrying a scroll tied with a deep blue ribbon. One by one, noble houses were announced. Elegant young women crossed the marble floor, bowed respectfully, and offered polite words to their king. Lucian greeted each of them with kindness, but his attention continued drifting toward the massive entrance leading into the eastern corridors. It happened so subtly that almost no one noticed except the council watching from above. Each time another name was called, his eyes searched beyond the ceremony instead of within it. Chancellor Roland Whitmore quietly folded his hands behind his back. He is searching, he murmured. He does not even realize it. Beside him, another council member whispered, the eastern corridor remains secure. Roland gave a slow nod, but the confidence in his expression had begun to fade. Meanwhile, Evelyn continued wandering only a few quiet hallways away, believing she had been forgotten entirely. The castle felt strangely alive around her. Portraits of long departed rulers lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow every careful step she took. Candlelight flickered against carved stone pillars where faded lunar symbols had nearly disappeared beneath centuries of careful restoration. None of those markings appeared anywhere inside the public halls she had passed earlier. It was as though this forgotten part of the palace belonged to an older kingdom hidden beneath the new one. Her footsteps finally carried her toward an open balcony overlooking the royal gardens. Fresh night air greeted her as she stepped outside. Below, white roses shimmered beneath the full moon while marble pathways curved around quiet fountains glowing like liquid silver. She closed her eyes for only a heartbeat, letting the cool breeze settle her thoughts. Then it came again. The same gentle warmth she had felt earlier spread quietly through her chest, not frightening, not overwhelming, simply familiar in a way she could not explain. At almost the exact same moment, Lucian suddenly stopped listening to the introductions altogether. His heartbeat slowed, then quickened with unmistakable certainty. The delicate fragrance of white jasmine returned, stronger than before, carried directly into the grand hall by the evening wind flowing through the open doors. Without thinking, he stepped away from the ceremonial platform. The musicians faltered. Noble families exchanged puzzled glances. Elder Magnus quickly moved beside him. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "the ceremony has not concluded." Lucian remained silent for a long moment, his silver eyes fixed upon the corridor beyond the ballroom. "Someone is here," he finally said, almost to himself. Magnus forced a reassuring smile. "Only invited guests and palace staff remain inside the castle." Lucian slowly turned toward him. "Then why does it feel as though the person I am supposed to meet has never entered this room?" Above them, Roland's expression changed for the first time that evening. Calm gave way to quiet alarm. He had spent decades studying forgotten prophecies, hidden records, and sealed decrees. He knew exactly what those words meant. Destiny had stopped waiting for permission, and for the first time in generations, the carefully built walls separating truth from the Alpha King had begun to crack beneath nothing more than the call of an unseen bond. Roland Whitmore did not wait for another sign. He quietly stepped away from the hidden gallery and disappeared through a narrow passage known only to the royal council, his measured footsteps echoing against ancient stone that had stood long before Blackthorn Keep became the heart of the kingdom. Deep beneath the castle, beyond locked iron gates and forgotten corridors, rested the Moon Archives, a chamber so old that even the oldest servants believed it existed only in legends. A single lantern illuminated shelves filled with weathered journals, sealed scrolls, and carved stone tablets that recorded the history no ruler wished the public to remember. Roland stopped before a wooden chest bound with silver bands and carefully lifted its heavy lid. Inside rested a faded family register bearing one name that had not been spoken openly inside the castle for decades. Evelyn Carter. His hand lingered over the page before opening it with unmistakable reluctance. The entry revealed almost nothing about titles or wealth. Instead, one sentence had been written in dark ink by an unknown hand many years earlier. Her bloodline must remain unseen until the final moon returns. Roland closed his eyes. Those words had guided generations of council members, yet none of them truly understood whether they had been protecting the kingdom or imprisoning its future. Above ground, Evelyn remained alone on the quiet balcony, overlooking the gardens. The moonlight reflected across the fountains while gentle wind carried the scent of jasmine through blooming white roses. She leaned lightly against the stone railing, searching the peaceful grounds below for a reason why her heart refused to settle. She had never believed herself important enough to be connected to royal secrets. Her childhood had been ordinary, shaped by kindness, modest work, and countless reminders that some doors simply were not meant for people like her. Even tonight, she assumed her presence inside the castle had been nothing more than a misunderstanding waiting to be corrected. Yet every passing moment made that explanation harder to believe. Somewhere beyond the gardens, distant music softened as though the celebration itself had begun to lose its certainty. Back inside the grand hall, Lucian politely excused himself from another conversation, earning puzzled expressions from noble families who had expected his complete attention. He crossed toward one of the enormous windows overlooking the eastern wing, guided by nothing more than instinct. The strange feeling had not disappeared. It had become clearer, calmer, almost like a quiet voice asking him to keep walking. Elder Magnus appeared beside him once again. "Your Majesty, the council requests that you remain for the remainder of the introductions." Lucian looked toward the moonlit gardens beyond the glass. "Have you ever ignored the feeling that something important was waiting just beyond the next door?" Magnus hesitated before offering a careful answer. "A king must often ignore feelings in order to protect the kingdom." Lucian smiled faintly, but there was sadness beneath it. "And if ignoring them causes the kingdom to lose something it was never meant to lose?" Magnus had no answer. At that same moment, a gentle breeze drifted through the open balcony where Evelyn stood. Almost without thinking, she turned toward the eastern tower, while far across the palace Lucian looked in exactly the same direction. Stone walls, winding corridors, and generations of carefully guarded secrets still separated them. Yet for one impossible heartbeat, they both felt the unmistakable certainty that someone was looking back, even though neither could possibly see the other. Hidden below the castle, Roland slowly extinguished his lantern and whispered words that vanished into the darkness before anyone else could hear them. May the moon forgive what we have protected for far too long. The ceremony continued exactly as tradition demanded, yet everyone inside the grand hall could sense that something invisible had shifted. The musicians still played graceful melodies, servants still carried silver trays between honored guests, and the noble families continued presenting themselves with polished confidence, but the rhythm of the evening had quietly fractured. Every few moments, the Alpha King found his attention drifting away from the celebration and toward the silent eastern wing. It was no longer simple curiosity. It felt like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Lucian stood near one of the towering windows overlooking the moonlit courtyard, watching the white banners sway gently in the cool night breeze. He had spent his entire life believing that every important decision required patience, reason, and careful judgment. Tonight, none of those qualities explained why his instincts refused to let him remain where he was. Elder Magnus approached once more, his expression respectful but noticeably uneasy. "Your Majesty, Chancellor Roland requests a private audience before the next stage of the ceremony." Lucian accepted with a quiet nod and followed him through an ornate doorway leading into a smaller council chamber where only a handful of lanterns illuminated the polished oak table at its center. Roland stood waiting with several senior council members, their solemn faces revealing that this meeting had been planned long before the celebration began. "Your Majesty," Roland began carefully, "before the ceremony proceeds any further, the council wishes to discuss the importance of stability." Lucian remained standing instead of taking the offered chair. "Stability usually follows truth," he replied calmly. "What truth are we avoiding tonight?" Silence settled over the room. The council members exchanged uncertain glances before Roland finally answered. "Not every question strengthens a kingdom simply because it is answered." Lucian studied each face around the table. None of them appeared dishonest, yet every one of them seemed burdened by knowledge they feared to reveal. "Then tell me this," he said quietly. "Has someone been deliberately kept away from the ceremony?" Roland did not answer immediately. His hesitation lasted only seconds, but it revealed more than any spoken confession could have. "Certain arrangements have been made in accordance with ancient obligations," he said at last. "Obligations to whom?" Lucian asked. "To the kingdom," Roland replied. "And to history." Those words settled heavily between them. Lucian looked toward the moonlight filtering through the chamber windows before speaking again, his voice steady and composed. "History should guide us. It should never imprison us." Without waiting for permission, he turned and walked toward the door, leaving the council members frozen in uneasy silence. At that very moment, Evelyn had quietly returned from the balcony and wandered into a circular hallway she had not noticed before. Moonlight poured through a magnificent stained glass dome overhead, casting soft patterns of silver and blue across the marble floor. At the center of the room stood an ancient stone pedestal engraved with symbols unlike any she had ever seen. As she stepped closer, the air around her became strangely still. A single beam of moonlight slipped through the glass above and rested gently upon the pedestal before slowly stretching across the floor until it reached the tips of her shoes. Evelyn looked down in quiet surprise, unaware that the same moonlight now reached through another window far across the castle, falling directly across Lucian's path as he left the council chamber. Though separated by walls, distance, and generations of carefully guarded secrets, both of them paused at exactly the same moment, each feeling the unmistakable certainty that destiny was no longer searching for them. It had finally found them both. The silence that followed felt heavier than every royal decree carved into the walls of Blackthorn Keep. Lucian walked alone through the eastern corridor, leaving behind the worried faces of the royal council without once looking back. Every polished stone beneath his feet reflected the pale glow of the full moon pouring through tall windows, creating long ribbons of silver that seemed to guide him deeper into the forgotten wing of the castle. He could not explain why each step felt familiar, as though he had dreamed of this path long before he had ever walked it. Behind him, Elder Magnus stopped at the entrance to the corridor but made no attempt to follow. The king's determination had become impossible to redirect. Moments later, Chancellor Roland appeared beside him, his normally calm expression marked by quiet concern. "Seal the western doors," Roland instructed in a low voice. "Delay the next stage of the ceremony. Tell the guests there has been a change in the royal schedule."
Magnus frågade.
That will only raise more questions.
Roland slowly nodded.
Questions are easier to survive than answers. Across the castle, Evelyn remained beneath the magnificent stained glass dome, studying the ancient carvings surrounding the circular pedestal. Moonlight continued resting gently upon the worn symbols, revealing details hidden beneath centuries of dust. She knelt beside the stone and brushed away a thin layer of age with careful fingertips. An unfamiliar crest slowly appeared beneath the powder, shaped like a crescent moon embracing a white wolf. Something about the image stirred a memory she could not fully reach. As a little girl, she vaguely remembered her grandmother tracing a similar symbol into the dirt outside their small cottage before quietly wiping it away whenever strangers approached. At the time, Evelyn had thought it was only an old family tradition. Now the memory returned with surprising clarity, carrying questions that had never seemed important until this very night. A gentle voice interrupted her thoughts. "You found it." Evelyn turned quickly to see an elderly woman wearing the simple gray robes of the palace librarians standing quietly beneath the archway. Her silver hair was neatly gathered behind her head, and her warm eyes carried none of the caution Evelyn had grown accustomed to receiving from others. "I am sorry," Evelyn said softly. "I did not mean to enter a place I should not be." The woman smiled with quiet kindness. "Perhaps you entered exactly where you were always meant to stand." Before Evelyn could ask what she meant, hurried footsteps echoed from another hallway. The librarian's gentle smile faded. She stepped backward into the shadows with surprising speed. "Not yet," she whispered. "There are still those who believe the past should remain asleep." By the time the palace guards rounded the corner, she had completely disappeared. Confused, Evelyn looked around the empty corridor, wondering if she had imagined the entire encounter. At that same moment, Lucian reached the far end of the eastern wing. The familiar fragrance of white jasmine filled the air once more, stronger than ever before. He stopped before a pair of ancient oak doors decorated with the very same crescent moon and white wolf crest Evelyn had just uncovered. His heartbeat became perfectly steady, filled not with uncertainty, but with absolute conviction. On the opposite side of those doors, separated by only a few yards of silent stone, Evelyn slowly lifted her head as the same quiet certainty settled into her heart. Neither of them had spoken a single word to the other. Neither had seen the other's face. Yet both understood with complete clarity that the next door opened would change far more than one night inside the castle. It would begin unraveling a secret that an entire kingdom had spent generations trying to keep hidden from the moon itself. Lucian rested his hand against the weathered oak doors, surprised by the quiet warmth flowing through the ancient wood beneath his fingertips. The carved crest of the crescent moon and white wolf seemed almost alive beneath the silver light spilling through the narrow windows. He had passed these forgotten corridors countless times throughout his childhood, yet no one had ever spoken of what lay beyond these doors. Behind him, hurried footsteps finally reached the hallway. Chancellor Roland stopped several feet away, his breathing calm but his voice carrying an urgency Lucian had never heard before. "Your Majesty, I ask you to leave this place." Lucian did not turn around. "Why?" Roland remained silent for several moments before answering. "Because some doors exist to protect those on both sides of them." Lucian slowly looked back. "Or because someone decided long ago that the truth should remain hidden." The Chancellor lowered his eyes without denying the accusation. Before another word could be spoken, the castle bells rang again, softer this time, as though reminding every soul within the palace that the full moon had reached its highest point. On the opposite side of the doors, Evelyn noticed the same sound echoing through the circular chamber beneath the stained glass dome. The ancient pedestal before her shimmered beneath the moonlight as tiny silver reflections danced across the engraved symbols. Without understanding why, she reached out and gently rested her palm upon the smooth stone surface. The moment her fingertips touched the ancient carving, a faint glow spread across the weathered lines of the crescent moon and white wolf. It was subtle enough that another person might have believed it was only moonlight shifting across old stone, yet Evelyn felt something deeper. A quiet warmth traveled through her hand, carrying an overwhelming sense of familiarity instead of fear. She quickly stepped back, staring in silent disbelief as the glow slowly faded once more. Hidden within a nearby alcove, the elderly librarian watched with quiet emotion before whispering to herself, "The old bond remembers." Back in the corridor, Lucian felt the same gentle warmth pass through the heavy oak doors and into his own hand. His heartbeat remained calm, but certainty settled over him with absolute clarity. Whatever waited beyond these doors was not a threat. It was the answer to every question that had followed him throughout the evening. Roland noticed the subtle change in Lucian's expression and closed his eyes briefly, as though accepting that the moment he had spent his entire life trying to prevent had finally arrived. "If you continue," he said softly, "nothing inside this kingdom will remain as it was before tonight." Lucian answered with quiet conviction. "Perhaps that is exactly what the kingdom has needed." He gently pushed against the ancient doors. At first they refused to move, their age holding them firmly in place. Then, with a slow echo that rolled through the silent corridor like a forgotten memory awakening, the heavy wood began to open. Moonlight streamed through the widening space, illuminating the circular chamber beyond. At the very same instant, Evelyn turned toward the sound, her eyes lifting as the ancient doorway she had never noticed before slowly revealed itself through the silver light. Neither of them spoke. Neither hurried forward. They simply stood motionless, separated by only a few careful steps, meeting one another's eyes for the very first time beneath the silent witness of the full moon, while around them the castle itself seemed to hold its breath, as though every stone had waited generations for this single impossible moment to finally begin. For a long moment, neither Lucian nor Evelyn moved. The moonlight flowing through the ancient chamber erased every difference between a king raised beneath royal banners and a young woman who had spent her life believing she belonged in the background. There were no witnesses cheering, no grand announcement, no ceremony to explain why the silence between them felt more powerful than every speech delivered that evening. Lucian met her eyes with quiet disbelief, not because he recognized her face, but because every unanswered question that had followed him through the castle suddenly became still. Evelyn felt the same impossible calm settle over her heart. The uncertainty that had haunted her since arriving at Blackthorn kept dissolved beneath a certainty she could not explain. It was not recognition born from memory. It was something older, gentler, and far beyond ordinary understanding. Behind Lucian, Chancellor Roland slowly lowered his head. Years of guarding forgotten secrets had led to this single moment, and for the first time, he understood that no decree, no council, and no carefully preserved tradition had ever possessed the power to erase what destiny remembered. The elderly librarian quietly stepped from the shadows on Evelyn's side of the chamber. Her expression held neither fear nor surprise, only quiet relief. "The moon has finally restored what history separated," she whispered. Evelyn turned toward her with countless questions waiting to be asked, but before she could speak, the librarian gently smiled. "Some answers cannot be given. They must be discovered together." Lucian slowly crossed the remaining distance until only a respectful space remained between them. He offered no dramatic declaration and reached for nothing. Instead, he simply inclined his head with the same dignity. He showed every honored guest. "I am Lucian Ashcroft," he said softly. Evelyn returned the gesture with quiet grace. "I am Evelyn Carter." The simplicity of those introductions somehow carried greater meaning than any royal title. Around them, the ancient chamber responded in the smallest of ways. Moonlight reflected more brightly through the stained glass dome, and the weathered carvings surrounding the pedestal seemed to shimmer with renewed life before settling once again into stillness. Nothing extraordinary demanded attention from the outside world, Yet those who understood the oldest stories would have recognized the silent confirmation that had just unfolded. Far beyond the Forgotten Wing, the celebration inside the grand hall slowly resumed, unaware that the true turning point of the evening had happened far from the royal stage. Noble guests continued speaking about alliances, traditions, and expectations, never realizing that the future of the kingdom had quietly begun changing in a hidden chamber beneath the full moon. Roland looked toward the ancient crest carved into the doorway and remembered the words preserved inside the oldest record of the Moon archives. The kingdom had never been warned to fear the forgotten bloodline. It had only been warned that truth would eventually return, no matter how carefully it was concealed. The warning had never been about destruction. It had always been about change. As the castle bells welcomed the first moments before dawn, Lucian and Evelyn stepped side by side toward the open doorway, leaving the hidden chamber behind without yet knowing what challenges awaited beyond its walls. Above them, the full moon shone with quiet brilliance over Blackthorn Keep, while the ancient crest of the crescent moon embracing the White Wolf caught the final silver light of the night, no longer standing as a forgotten symbol of the past, but as the first promise of a future that neither fear nor history would be able to silence forever.